Water makes its own rules at night. It doesn't just flow. It edits. It removes edges. It steals depth. It turns a familiar place into something that looks the same until you step wrong, and then it's too late to explain yourself. The industrial zone sat at the edge of the county like an old scar that never fully healed, a web of warehouses, service roads, fenced yards, and the hulking spine of a chemical processing facility that had been modernized just enough to keep operating and neglected just enough to keep everyone uneasy. The river ran alongside it, swollen from days of rain. Tonight, the river had spilled over its boundaries and started taking bites out of the city. When Officer Ethan Cole rolled in, headlights slicing through the drizzle, the whole place looked like it was holding its breath. Floodlights from distant poles blinked and hissed, throwing pale cones onto pools of standing water. Corrugated metal walls sweated in the cold. Warning signs, corrosive, no entry, authorized personnel only, glimmered wetly as if the ink itself was afraid to be washed away. Ethan didn't hurry. He moved the way he always moved when the world got loud, slow enough to hear the details, controlled enough to keep his body from announcing panic. Calm was not the absence of fear. Calm was a decision you made over and over until it became a habit. Beside him, in the passenger seat, K9 Shadow sat upright with the posture of a professional. Not rigid, not restless, just assembled. His black and tan coat looked almost matte under the dashboard glow, water beating at the edges of his fur where it met the open crack of the window. His ears made small adjustments, triangulating the night. Shadow didn't bark. He didn't whine. His nose worked, and his eyes, dark, intelligent, steady, kept flicking between Ethan and the world outside, like a partner checking a shared map. The radio had called it in as a distress signal, which was the kind of phrase dispatch used when they didn't want to say what everyone was thinking. Someone's in trouble, and they might not be able to talk anymore. The last transmission had been short, a strangled breath, metal clanging. A voice, female, strained, unmistakable to those who knew it. Unit, echo, corridor. Then a hard burst of static. Then nothing. Ethan killed the engine at the perimeter gate and sat for half a second longer than most people would have tolerated. Not because he was indecisive, but because he was listening to the silence for what it was hiding. Rain ticked against the windshield. Far off, a pump throbbed like a heartbeat. Somewhere inside the facility, an alarm, faint, intermittent, stuttered as if even the building wasn't sure it should be screaming. He glanced at Shadow. Shadow's gaze met his in the mirror reflection of the side window for a fraction of a second. In that look was the thing Ethan trusted more than any radio: confirmation, readiness, the unspoken agreement that neither of them would pretend this was routine. Ethan thumbed the mic. "Dispatch, Unit 12 on scene. I'm at the chemical facility perimeter." Static answered, then a jittery voice. "Copy? Unit 12, stand by. Additional units are en route. We lost Captain Hayes' signal." Ethan's jaw tightened at the name. He didn't react outwardly, but his body registered it like a punch that landed clean. Captain Maria Hayes wasn't just a supervisor. She was the kind of leader who didn't hide behind a desk when the weather turned ugly or when a call sounded wrong. She showed up. She looked people in the eyes. She made hard calls, then carried the consequences without complaint. She was also the one person in Ethan's chain of command who never treated his quietness like weakness. "ETA?" Ethan asked. 10 to 12 minutes for first unit." "Hazmat team is staging," Ethan cut in, voice even. "Negative. I'm going in." A pause. "Unit 12, protocol." Ethan looked at the river line spilling into the service road. Water was already licking at the facility's lower doors. Every minute washed away scent. Every minute erased evidence. Every minute turned missing into lost. Shadow's head angled toward the gate as if he'd heard the same calculus. Ethan clicked off the mic. Not to ignore dispatch out of ego. To preserve the small advantage they still had, time. He stepped out into the rain, boots meeting shallow water with a muted splash. The air tasted metallic, wet steel, diesel, and something faintly sharp that made the back of his throat tighten. Chemical, not strong, not yet, but enough to tell him the place was awake. He opened the rear door and snapped Shadow's harness into place with practiced efficiency. The strap slid across Shadow's chest. The handle settled where Ethan could grab it without thinking. Shadow held still, letting the gear become part of him. The moment the last buckle clicked, Shadow stepped forward a fraction, eager without being frantic. Ethan's gloved hand rested briefly on Shadow's shoulder. Not petting, not reassurance. A point of contact that said, "I'm here, I'm with you." Then Ethan swung the gate open just wide enough and slipped through. Inside, the facility's yard was a maze. Shipping containers stacked like blunt monuments, catwalks and staircases stitched between buildings. Pipes ran overhead like exposed veins. Floodwater had crept into the low spots, turning the ground into a shifting mirror that reflected hazard lights and broken lines. The distress call had been traced to the south side, near the sealed hazardous corridor. A part of the plant kept off-limits to standard patrol because of storage tanks and controlled access points. The kind of place that punished mistakes. Ethan moved with his flashlight low, beam cutting across water and metal. He didn't point it at windows unless he had to. Light told the night where you were. Shadow stayed slightly ahead and to Ethan's left, nose low, pulling with subtle pressure on the lead. The dog's attention wasn't scattered. It was threaded, focused on something Ethan couldn't see, but trusted anyway. Halfway across the yard, Ethan saw it. A snapped radio antenna lying near a puddle, bent like a broken finger. He crouched, careful not to splash too much, and picked it up with 2 fingers. The base was jagged, torn by force, not a clean break. A struggle then. Shadow paused, sniffed the air around the antenna, then shifted toward the left, body lowering. Ethan's throat tightened. "Find her," he murmured. Not a command so much as a vow. Shadow's tail stiffened, held level. Then Shadow pulled. Ethan followed. 2. Inciting incident. The sealed corridor entrance looked like the mouth of something that had learned to eat. 2 heavy metal doors sat beneath an overhang marked with faded hazard striping. A keypad panel blinked a dull green, then sputtered to red, then green again, like it was trying to remember what it was supposed to do. The floodwater here was deeper, swirling around Ethan's shins. Cold seeped through the seams of his boots. He forced his body to ignore it. Cold was information, but it wasn't the mission. Shadow stopped directly in front of the doors and lifted his nose, inhaling in slow, measured pulls. His ears pivoted, listening past the hiss of rain and the distant mechanical thrum. Ethan leaned in toward the keypad, light angled away, and saw the security seal, intact on the left, peeled on the right. The door had been opened recently, then shut again. His radio crackled. He'd turned it back on as they moved in. "Unit 12, this is Dr. Lena Moore. I'm patched in with dispatch and facility security. Ethan, do you copy?" Ethan's stomach tightened again. Doctor. Moore wasn't law enforcement, but she might as well have been. Brilliant, introspective, and dangerous in the quiet way. Dangerous to lies. Dangerous to sloppy assumptions. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "Copy," Ethan said. "I'm seeing access logs from the facility's security system," Dr. Moore continued, words crisp despite the interference. The sealed corridor was opened at 21:46. Ethan checked his watch. The distress call had come in minutes after that. "Who opened it?" Ethan asked, already knowing he wouldn't like the answer. A beat. Then Dr. Moore, "Captain Maria Hayes' badge." Ethan didn't move. The rain didn't stop. The facility didn't magically become less hostile. But something inside him went very still. "Confirm," he said. "I ran it twice," Dr. Moore replied. "Her badge ID, her clearance tier, her authentication sequence. It's either her or someone had her badge." Ethan's eyes narrowed at the keypad, at the door, at the waterline rising like a slow threat. Maria Hayes opening a sealed hazardous corridor alone didn't fit the woman Ethan knew. She was brave, yes, but she wasn't careless. She didn't ignore protocol when it mattered. Which meant one of 2 things. She was forced or she was baited. Dr. Moore's voice lowered. "And Ethan, there's more. The camera feed in that sector goes dead at 21:47, 1 minute after the door opens." "System failure?" Ethan asked. "Not likely," Dr. Moore said. "The pattern suggests intentional disruption. Lights in that corridor are on a separate power strip. Someone triggered a manual override." Ethan felt the shape of the trap forming. This wasn't just a rescue. It was a staged environment. Water, darkness, controlled access, designed to isolate and erase. Shadow gave a low sound, not a bark, not a growl. A breathy warning that made Ethan's muscles tense. Shadow's body angled slightly to the right, then back to the door. The dog was reading something: scent, movement, a change in the air pressure inside. "Ethan," Dr. Moore said, "if they tampered with the corridor systems, you could be walking into hazardous exposure. Do you have a mask?" "Standard kit," Ethan answered. "And your backup is—" "Not here yet," Ethan said. Silence on the line. Dr. Moore didn't argue. She never wasted words when she knew someone had already decided. Instead, she did what she always did. She gave the most useful truth. "Be aware," she said. "If the pumps are compromised, water will rise fast in the low corridors. And if they're manipulating valves—" "Understood," Ethan said. He reached into his utility pouch, pulled out a compact respirator mask, and fitted it with quick hands. Shadow watched, calm and alert, as if he recognized the ritual of entering a place that could kill you without a weapon. Ethan pressed his badge to the keypad, not because it mattered more than Maria's, but because it documented his entry. A small tether to accountability. A thin thread to truth. The panel blinked. The door clicked. Then it groaned open, slow and heavy, revealing darkness inside that smelled like wet concrete and something sharp enough to sting even through a mask. Shadow stepped forward first, nails clicking on metal. Ethan followed, flashlight low, heart steady, not because he was fearless, because fear was a luxury you couldn't afford when someone's air was running out. The door shut behind them with a final echoing thud. Inside, the corridor swallowed sound and returned it wrong. The walls were poured concrete, painted a dull institutional gray. Pipes ran overhead in thick bundles, condensation dripping in slow, irregular drops that sounded like distant footsteps when you weren't careful with your mind. The floor sloped gently downward, collecting water that streamed in thin sheets along the sides. A faint emergency light glowed at intervals, but it flickered, on, off, on, making the corridor feel like it was blinking. Ethan's flashlight beam caught warning labels on the pipes. Caustic line, vent control, pressure lock. He moved forward with the kind of precision that came from long years of walking into rooms where someone might be waiting. His steps were measured, heel to toe, minimizing splash. His shoulders stayed loose. His breathing stayed even behind the mask. Shadow moved like a shadow was supposed to move, quiet, decisive, always slightly ahead, occasionally pausing to sample the air. Then Shadow stopped so abruptly, Ethan nearly collided with him. Shadow's ears snapped forward. His tail stiffened, not wagging, not relaxed. His nose angled toward a side junction where the corridor split. Ethan's flashlight drifted toward the junction, and the light hit something on the wall. A smear, dark, streaked, thin, not oil, not rust. Blood. Ethan's stomach tightened. He lowered the beam, scanned the floor. There were drag marks, faint lines in the shallow water where something heavy had been pulled, or someone had tried to crawl and been dragged back. He clicked his radio mic. "Dr. Moore, I have blood inside the corridor." "Static, then." "Copy. That supports the timeline. Ethan, watch the left branch. That's where the lowest point is. If water rises—" Ethan didn't answer right away because Shadow had begun to move again, angling toward the right branch. Shadow's decision wasn't random. It wasn't curiosity. It was information. Ethan followed the dog's choice. The right branch narrowed, ceiling dropping slightly. The air felt thicker here, more chemical, more stale. Vent fans above were either off or barely spinning, moving air like a reluctant hand. Ethan's flashlight beam caught a maintenance panel ajar on the wall, wires exposed. Someone had been inside. Someone had touched the building's nervous system. Then, faintly, Ethan heard it. Not a voice, not words, a rhythmic knock, metal against metal, slow and uneven, like someone using the last of their strength to produce proof they were still there. Ethan froze, listening. The knock came again. Shadow's head snapped toward a heavy steel hatch in the floor, a maintenance access cover marked with a yellow triangle and black text. Maintenance chamber. Authorized personnel only. Shadow let out a soft huff and pressed his nose to the hatch seam. His body trembled with contained energy. Not panic, not excitement, but urgency. Ethan crouched and ran his gloved hand along the edge. The hatch was latched, not welded, not permanently sealed, but locked. He checked the latch, industrial padlock, fresh metal, no rust. Someone had placed it recently. Ethan's calm tightened into something sharper. They didn't just trap her, they secured her. He pressed his ear near the hatch, flashlight angled away. Another knock. Weaker now. Ethan swallowed. "Maria," he said, not loudly. "Captain Hayes, it's Ethan." A pause, then a faint sound, like a breath that scraped. "Then?" The voice was thin, strained, but unmistakable. Relief punched through him so hard it nearly cracked his composure. He didn't let it show. Maria needed a leader, not a man falling apart. "I've got you," he said. "Stay with me." Shadow sat immediately beside the hatch, eyes locked on Ethan as if to say, "Do it, now." Ethan tried the padlock with his multi-tool. Useless. He tried leverage with the tool's edge, muscles straining. The lock held. Water continued to slip along the corridor floor, gathering, rising millimeter by millimeter, like an insult. Ethan clicked his radio. "Dr. Moore, she's in a maintenance chamber under a locked hatch. They used a fresh padlock." Dr. Moore's voice sharpened. "You can't waste time. Do you have cutters?" "Negative," Ethan said. Another pause, then Dr. Moore. "Then you need force. But carefully. If the chamber houses valves—" "I know," Ethan said, voice tight. He looked around. The corridor offered concrete walls, pipes, and a maintenance cabinet bolted to the side. Ethan moved to it, yanked it open. Inside, a long pry bar. His hands closed around it like it had been waiting. He returned to the hatch, set the pry bar under the lock's shackle, braced his boot against the hatch edge. Shadow shifted closer, shoulder pressed lightly against Ethan's shin, grounding him, steadying him, reminding him his body wasn't alone in this effort. Ethan exhaled once, slow. Then he drove his weight into the bar. Metal screamed softly. The lock resisted. Ethan adjusted angle, forced his shoulders to relax, then pushed again with controlled power. The shackle bent. He pushed once more, harder, and the padlock snapped with a sharp crack that echoed down the corridor like a gunshot. Shadow didn't flinch. Ethan didn't celebrate. He ripped the broken lock away and lifted the hatch with both hands. It was heavy, but adrenaline made him strong. The hatch rose, revealing a vertical ladder down into darkness. A rush of air came up from below, stale, damp, carrying the unmistakable scent of human fear and sweat. "Maria!" Ethan called down, keeping his voice anchored. "I'm coming." He hooked Shadow's lead to his belt, then started down the ladder. The metal rungs were slick. Water dripped from above. Ethan descended with careful speed, boots finding each rung with certainty. The chamber below was cramped. Concrete walls, pipes, a control box blinking weakly, water pooled ankle-deep on the floor. The air tasted wrong, metallic and sharp. Captain Maria Hayes sat slumped against the wall, wrists bound with zip ties, her face pale under the emergency light. A bruise darkened the edge of her jaw. Her uniform shirt was soaked, clinging. Her breathing was short, controlled, but strained, the kind of breathing you used when ribs hurt. Her eyes lifted, and for a moment her leadership mask faltered. Not weakness, just human exhaustion. Ethan crouched in front of her. "You did good," he said simply, because sometimes praise was a lifeline. "I'm here." Shadow climbed down behind Ethan with surprising grace, paws landing softly in the water. The moment Shadow saw Maria, his posture changed, ears forward, body angled protectively between her and the ladder, as if the chamber itself could produce another attacker. Maria's gaze flicked to Shadow, and something in her eyes softened. A fraction. A release. "You shouldn't have come alone," she rasped. Ethan's mouth tightened. "I didn't." He nodded to Shadow, and Maria gave a faint, breathless sound that might have been a laugh if she'd had more air. Ethan pulled his zip-tie cutter from his vest and snapped the restraints off her wrists. Her hands trembled as circulation returned. "How bad?" Ethan asked, scanning her quickly. "Bruising, possible rib injury, hypothermia risk." "Banged up," Maria said. "They took my badge, forced me to open the corridor. When I resisted—" She swallowed, jaw tightening. "They wanted it quiet." Ethan didn't ask who, not yet. His priority was movement. The water in the chamber was colder than above, and it felt higher than it had a minute ago. Ethan's instinct screamed a simple equation. Time is air, air is life. He helped Maria to her feet, keeping a firm grip at her elbow. She hissed through teeth, pain in ribs or shoulder. But she stood. Shadow pressed close to her other side without being told, offering his body like a moving brace. Ethan glanced up the ladder, and that's when Shadow's ears snapped toward the hatch. Shadow's head lifted, nose flaring. His body went still in that surgical way that meant one thing. Someone was near. Ethan's hand went to his sidearm. Above them, through the hatch, came a sound. Footsteps. Slow, confident. Not the rushing steps of backup arriving to help. The measured pace of someone returning to finish a job. Ethan met Maria's eyes. His voice dropped to a low, controlled thread. "They're back." Maria's face hardened, pain still there, but leadership reclaiming its shape. "Then we move." Shadow didn't bark. He didn't need to. He leaned toward the ladder, poised, ready to become the first line of defense in a fight where visibility, sound, and space were all working against them. And Ethan, calm, disciplined, sharp, instincted Ethan, felt grief and anger and responsibility compress into a single, clear purpose. Get her out. Keep Shadow safe. Stop whoever thinks this place belongs to them. The footsteps above paused. Then the hatch shadow shifted as if someone knelt to look down. Ethan raised his gun toward the ladder, finger indexed, breath steady. Shadow's body lowered, muscles loaded like a spring. Maria took one shallow breath and braced herself against the wall. The building hummed, the water moved, and the corridor above held its breath right before the next phase of the night began. The hatch above didn't open. That was the first wrong thing. If it had been one of their own, there would have been a voice, Lucas shouting a joking, breathless "Cole," even in a nightmare of machinery and water. If it had been facility security, there would have been the clumsy authority of someone who wanted to sound brave while their pulse betrayed them. Instead, there was only the soft scrape of something dragged across concrete. Metal on stone, careful, quiet. Ethan's brain did what it always did when the world tightened. It simplified. Unknown person above, they have position, they have intent. The room is a trap. Shadow's ears angled toward the hatch seam, then toward the ladder, then back again. He wasn't confused. He was mapping. His nose flared in short pulls, tasting air that seeped down like a warning. Maria shifted her weight and winced. The motion was small, but in the tight chamber it sounded enormous, fabric against concrete, a breath-catching. The scrape above stopped. Ethan held still, weapon raised, his body in the kind of quiet readiness that didn't require muscle tension. Tension wasted energy. Tension made you shake. Calm kept you precise. He leaned slightly toward Shadow's harness, not pulling, just touching, an anchor point. Shadow's eyes flicked to Ethan once, quick and meaningful, then returned upward. Ethan brought his radio mic up but didn't transmit yet. Sound traveled strangely in these corridors. If the person above wasn't sure they'd found Maria, a single word could confirm it. Instead, Ethan whispered to Dr. Moore, voice barely louder than the drip of condensation. "Lena, someone's at the hatch. I'm not making noise. Stand by." Static breathed back, and then Dr. Moore's voice came, low, tight. "Copy. Facility sensors show motion at the corridor junction. Ethan, if they're using that hatch, they're close enough to cut your exit." Ethan's mouth set. "Understood." Maria's gaze stayed on Ethan's face, trying to read what he wasn't saying. Ethan didn't give her fear. He gave her a plan. "Up first," he murmured. "I'll be right behind. Shadow stays between you and the hatch." Maria nodded once, grim. She moved to the ladder with Shadow's shoulder pressed against her thigh like a silent cane. Ethan watched her hands grip the rungs, knuckles whitening. Her breathing was shallow but controlled. The kind of control that came from years of refusing to let pain make decisions. Shadow waited until she was one rung up, then placed his paws on the ladder, ready. Ethan's eyes stayed on the hatch opening, and then the hatch shifted. Not opening, but vibrating, as if someone placed weight on it, testing, feeling for resistance. A thin beam of light cut through the gap for half a second, weak, filtered, like a flashlight held under a jacket. Then the beam vanished. The hatch lifted. Cold air poured down, carrying rain scent and something else, oil, sweat, and the distinct chemical tang of gunmetal. Ethan didn't fire. Not yet. Not until he had a target and a reason. A face appeared at the opening, partially obscured by the angle, but enough for Ethan to see the lower half, jaw clenched, a scarf pulled up, breath fogging in the damp. The figure leaned farther. Shadow moved, not up, not away. Shadow surged up the ladder in a burst of controlled power, shoulders brushing the metal sides, silent until his head broke into the corridor above. A single sharp bark exploded out of him, short, violent, purposeful, like a thrown knife. The figure jerked back with a curse. Ethan used the moment. "Move!" he hissed to Maria. Maria climbed, faster now despite the pain, Shadow's bark having bought them exactly what Ethan needed. Seconds. Ethan climbed behind them, one hand on the ladder, the other keeping his sidearm angled up. Above, boots scrambled, repositioning. The figure had stepped away from the hatch. Smart. They didn't want to be pulled down into a choke point. Ethan emerged into the corridor last, shoulders rolling out of the hatch, and shoved the hatch cover partly closed behind him, not locking it, but reducing the opening. He could feel the corridor's cold, wet air on his cheeks, even through the mask. He lifted his flashlight and scanned. Nothing. The corridor was empty in both directions, but Ethan could hear movement now, retreating steps, then a pause, then a different set of steps, farther away. They weren't alone, not just one, and the building kept breathing wrong, emergency lights flickering, vents struggling, water pushing along the floor. Shadow stood in front of Maria, body angled protectively, head low. He wasn't barking now. He was listening. Ethan guided Maria to the right wall, positioning her where she could lean without slipping. He kept his own shoulder between her and the corridor branch ahead. "Ethan," Dr. Moore crackled softly, "I'm picking up another system change. Pumps just kicked off in your sector." Ethan felt it immediately. The thin sheet of water along the floor began to thicken, pooling faster. "Someone's trying to drown the corridor," Maria rasped. Ethan nodded once. "Or force us into a funnel." Shadow suddenly moved, not forward toward the exit, but toward the left branch, the lower point Dr. Moore had warned about. His nose dipped, his body stiffening. Ethan's pulse stayed steady, but his mind sharpened. Shadow wasn't curious. Shadow was reading intent. "They're down there," Ethan murmured. Maria's eyes narrowed. "They're circling." "And waiting for the water to do their work," Ethan said. He checked his watch again. Backup should be close, but close wasn't here. Here was Ethan, Shadow, and Maria in a corridor designed to erase evidence. Ethan clicked his radio, voice tight but calm. "Dispatch, Unit 12. Captain Maria Hayes, located alive. She's injured. We are moving for extraction. Suspects on site. Repeat, suspects on site." Static, then a familiar voice, young, eager, trying to sound professional. "Unit 12, Deputy Lucas Reed is 2 minutes out. Ethan, say again. Captain Hayes is with you?" Relief didn't soften Ethan's face, but it loosened something in his chest. "Affirmative. We need a secure perimeter at the corridor entrance, and Reed, watch your footing. Water's rising." "Copy that," Lucas said, breath audible now, as if he was running. "I've got eyes on the facility yard. Lights are a mess out here. Somebody's definitely messing with power." Ethan looked at Shadow, then at Maria. The simplest path was to move straight toward the corridor entrance and hope the suspects didn't get bold. But Shadow's stance told Ethan something else. The suspects were positioning. They were trying to cut their line, which meant if Ethan walked into their setup, Maria might not walk out. Ethan made a decision without drama, without a speech. He turned his flashlight beam down, angled away from the corridor, and whispered to Shadow, "Show me." Shadow moved, not fast, deliberate. He led them forward toward the junction where the blood smear had been. He wasn't tracking Maria now, he was tracking the men who'd put her there. Ethan guided Maria with one hand at her elbow. Shadow's body stayed between them and open space, like a living shield that also happened to have a brain tuned to threats. The corridor widened slightly at the junction. Pipes overhead hummed as water pressure shifted. A sign on the wall read, "Maintenance Access, Vent Control." Shadow's head snapped right. Ethan followed his gaze and saw something on the floor, fresh scuff marks, disturbed water, a footprint half erased by runoff. Someone had been here moments ago. Shadow's tail went rigid. He lowered his head. Then he froze. Ethan saw it a heartbeat later. The faint line of a tripwire stretched across the corridor at shin height, almost invisible in the flickering light. A simple device, not flashy, not cinematic, just effective. Ethan's stomach tightened. "They planned this," Maria's voice was a rasp. "They wanted responders to fall, break a leg, lose a gun, create chaos." Ethan nodded, eyes scanning. The tripwire was attached to a maintenance cabinet handle. If triggered, it would yank something, maybe a pipe valve, maybe an alarm, maybe a release of something worse. Ethan crouched, carefully stepping over it, then guided Maria around with slow precision. Shadow stepped over it like he'd been born knowing where danger lived. And then, movement. A shadow broke at the far end of the left branch, just a flicker. a shape hugging the wall, trying to use darkness as camouflage. Ethan didn't chase. He didn't shout. He turned his flashlight off. Darkness swallowed the corridor except for the intermittent emergency flicker, which now became advantage instead of liability. Under flickering light, movement lied. Shadow's ears angled forward, his breathing slowed. Ethan lowered his voice to the calmest tone he had. "Stay with me," he murmured to Maria. "Don't run." Maria nodded once, pressing her back to the wall, gun absent. She'd been disarmed. Ethan raised his sidearm but kept it low. He waited. A step. Another. The figure moved closer, believing Ethan had lost visual. Then Shadow moved. Not barking, not lunging blindly. Shadow slid forward like a dark thought, positioning himself slightly ahead of Ethan. The emergency light blinked on, and for a split second illuminated a man crouched behind a pipe column, a handgun raised. Shadow's growl erupted low and deep. The man flinched. Instinct, fear, surprise. Ethan fired once, not to kill, to control. The shot cracked against concrete, striking just beside the man's hand, splintering a pipe bracket and making the handgun clatter to the wet floor. The man cursed and lunged forward, not toward Ethan, but toward Maria. Ethan's composure snapped into pure action. "Shadow!" Shadow launched. His body hit the attacker's legs low, slamming into knee and shin with practiced force. The man went down hard, shoulder hitting the wet floor. Shadow didn't tear, he didn't maul. He pinned, teeth clamped on fabric at the man's pant leg, holding him in place like a vice. Ethan stepped in, boot on the man's wrist before the man could reach for the dropped gun. He twisted the arm into a compliance hold and slapped on cuffs from his belt with 2 fast clicks. "You're done," Ethan said, voice flat. He didn't insult. Insults were for men who needed to prove something. The attacker spat into the water. "You don't know what you walked into." Ethan's eyes stayed cold. "I know you tried to drown a captain in a maintenance chamber." The man's smile was thin, ugly. "She opened the door." Maria's voice cut in, sharp despite her pain, "because you put a gun in my face." The man's expression flickered, only for a moment, but it was enough for Ethan to see there were layers here. Not just petty criminals, not just opportunists. Organized, confident, used to controlling spaces. Shadow held the man still until Ethan gave a quiet signal. 2 taps on the harness handle. Shadow released and moved back to Ethan's side immediately, posture alert. Ethan didn't ask questions. Not now. He scanned the corridor. The man had approached alone, but the earlier footsteps had sounded like more than one, and if this group was smart enough to set tripwires and manipulate pumps, they were smart enough to use one man as a distraction. Dr. Moore's voice crackled, urgent now. "Ethan, water's rising faster than expected. The corridor's low points will flood in minutes, and I'm seeing pressure fluctuations. Valves are being adjusted." Ethan's mind ran the map. "They're trying to force a spill," he murmured. Maria's jaw tightened. "They want to make responders back off, hide whatever they're doing." Ethan looked down the corridor toward the sealed corridor entrance. Freedom lay that way. Backup, air, light. But if the valves were being adjusted, if a hazardous spill was being triggered, then a straight retreat could walk them into invisible poison. Ethan raised his radio. "Lucas, Reed, where are you?" Lucas's voice came back, breathless, wet with rain. "At the perimeter door. I can see the sealed corridor entry. Water's up to my boots out here. Ethan, I'm getting facility alarms now. Something's not right." Ethan's eyes narrowed. "Hold position. Don't enter the corridor until I say. There may be hazardous release." "Copy," Lucas said, then added, almost against his own fear, "Captain Hayes?" Ethan glanced at Maria. She steadied her breathing, chin lifting. Ethan answered, "She's alive, she's moving." A breath of relief in Lucas's voice. Okay. Tell her," Ethan cut in, firm. "Stay sharp." He turned to Maria. "We go now. We don't run. We don't rush into their next trap. Shadow leads." Maria nodded. Shadow stepped forward, and Ethan followed, guiding Maria in the narrow path between pipes and rising water. Behind them, the cuffed attacker struggled weakly, then stilled. He knew. Fighting now was useless. Ahead, the corridor's emergency lights flickered harder, faster, like the building was failing. Water rose from a thin sheet to a shallow current that pushed against Ethan's ankles. Cold seeped in, biting. Ethan's flashlight stayed off. He used the flickering emergency lights and Shadow's body language. Shadow's head lifted, nostrils flaring. He paused, then moved again, choosing a path along the right wall where the floor seemed less submerged. Ethan trusted him. They reached a wider section near the corridor exit, and Ethan could see the heavy door at the end, the one that led out to the yard. Relief was close enough to taste. Then Shadow stopped. His whole body went stiff, tail straight, ears forward. He wasn't looking at the door. He was looking up, toward a set of pipes overhead where steam began to hiss. Ethan followed Shadow's gaze and felt his stomach turn. A valve wheel had been turned, recently, forcefully. Pressure built behind the pipes like anger. "Doctor." Moore's voice came sharper, almost a warning cut into sound. "Ethan, if that valve releases, you could have a corrosive mist. Do not walk under it." Ethan swallowed, eyes scanning for another route. There was only one other passage, a narrow stairwell to the left leading up into a catwalk that ran above the corridor and toward the exit door. It wasn't a new scene. It was part of the same space, same corridor system, same escape route. But it was a risk. Narrow steps, slick with water. Maria injured, the catwalk possibly unstable. Ethan made the call because that's what his archetype did. Fast, decisive, life first. "We go up," he murmured. "Shadow, up." Shadow moved to the stairwell instantly. Ethan guided Maria to the first step. She winced, breath-catching. Ethan tightened his grip under her arm. "Slow," he said. "One step at a time." Maria's eyes burned with frustration, but she nodded. "I'm moving." Behind them, steam hissed louder. The valve overhead was close to releasing. Shadow climbed the stairs with a quiet urgency, pause, finding traction like he'd trained for exactly this kind of chaos. Ethan followed, half supporting Maria, his muscles burning in controlled effort. At the top, the catwalk trembled slightly under their combined weight. Metal groaned, water dripped from overhead beams. The flood below looked darker now, thickening, pulling. Ethan didn't look down. He kept his eyes on the exit door ahead and the pipes overhead that carried death inside them. Shadow moved forward, head low, sniffing the catwalk surface. He paused once, sniffing at a spot where muddy footprints smeared the metal. Someone had been up here. Ethan's jaw tightened. They were close to the door, 10 yards, maybe less. Then, from ahead, a faint shape moved behind a column. A silhouette. Ethan lifted his gun. The emergency light flickered, and for a split second, the silhouette became a man in a rain-dark jacket, crouched, holding something long and metallic. Could be a crowbar, could be a weapon. The man's head turned, eyes catching the glint of Ethan's barrel. The man raised his arm. Ethan didn't wait. "Down!" he barked, shoving Maria to a knee behind a pipe column as he fired. One controlled shot, then another. Aimed not at the man's chest, but at the metal near his hand, the way you disarm a threat when the world around you can kill you just as fast as a bullet. The man jerked back, the metallic object clattering onto the catwalk with a loud bang. Shadow lunged forward in the same instant, body low, fast, silent until the last second. The man stumbled, slipped on wet metal, and Shadow slammed into him, knocking him sideways into the railing. Ethan surged forward, gun still up, moving with the precision of someone trained to make chaos small. The man struggled, trying to push Shadow away, trying to reach for something at his waist. Ethan stepped in, boot pinning the man's hand, then drove him face down with a controlled force that didn't waste motion. "Don't!" Ethan said, voice flat. The man spat water and cursed, eyes wild. "You can't stop it!" A sharp metallic scream cut him off. Below the catwalk, the valve released. A burst of white mist erupted from the pipes, flooding the corridor beneath with a corrosive-looking fog. Ethan's stomach clenched. If they'd stayed below, they would have walked into that. Shadow's ears flicked, but he didn't break focus. His job wasn't to understand chemistry. His job was to keep his partner alive. Ethan slapped cuffs on the man's wrists with 2 quick clicks, then yanked him to the side so the catwalk path remained open. Maria breathed hard, crouched behind the pipe column, eyes fixed on the fog below. Ethan reached back to her, steady. "We're out." Shadow moved ahead, guiding them around the cuffed man. Ethan half lifted Maria to her feet again. She grunted in pain, but stood. They moved down the catwalk toward the exit door, the fog below spreading like a ghost. Ethan's shoulder brushed the door handle. He shoved it. The door didn't budge. Locked. Ethan's pulse spiked for the first time, not into panic, but into anger. Someone had locked the exit from the outside. He slammed his shoulder into it once. The metal groaned, but held. Shadow barked once, sharp, urgent. Ethan's eyes flicked to the side and saw a manual latch mechanism, industrial, stiff, designed to keep doors sealed during hazards. It required leverage. Ethan grabbed the dropped metallic object near the first attacker's position, a crowbar. He jammed it into the latch joint and pulled. The latch resisted, then gave a fraction. Ethan pulled harder, muscles screaming. Maria braced herself against the wall, trying to help with her limited strength. Shadow stood behind Ethan, body pressed into Ethan's thigh, grounding, lending silent power. The latch snapped free with a metallic crack. Ethan shoved the door open. Cold rain and open air hit them like salvation. Outside, the yard was chaos, floodlights flickering, sirens distant, water surging along the pavement. And there, near the corridor entrance, Deputy Lucas Reed stood with his weapon drawn, eyes wide, rain dripping off his eyebrows like commas. "Ethan!" Lucas shouted. Then his gaze snapped to Maria. "Captain!" Maria raised her chin, voice rough. "Still here, Reed." Lucas's face tightened with relief so strong it almost looked like pain. "Yes, ma'am." Ethan didn't let the moment become sentimental. Not yet. He scanned the yard. "Secure the entrance," he ordered. "We've got at least 2 suspects cuffed inside, one in the corridor branch, one on the catwalk. More may be present." Lucas nodded fast, all competence under the rookie energy. "Copy. I'll hold." "Doctor." Moore's voice came through the radio, calmer now but still sharp. "Ethan, corrosive mist is spreading in the corridor. Do not re-enter without hazmat." "Understood," Ethan said. He guided Maria away from the door, toward higher ground where the water was shallower. Lucas moved with them, covering angles, eyes darting. Shadow stayed glued to Ethan's left side, wet fur brushing Ethan's leg. Not clingy, not needy, present. Ethan could feel Shadow's breathing, a steady rhythm that kept Ethan's own heartbeat from escalating. Then the facility alarms changed. A new tone, higher, more urgent, cut through rain and sirens. Lucas's head snapped up. "What is that?" Dr. Moore answered before Ethan could. "Pressure spike. Someone is still manipulating valves. Ethan, if they trigger a full hazardous spill, it could affect the yard. You need to move Captain Hayes to safe distance now." Ethan's eyes narrowed, scanning the yard for movement. Fog curled near the corridor door from inside. Rain fell harder. The floodwater glimmered with oily rainbow sheens where it met runoff. And somewhere, beyond the floodlights, a figure moved along a far fence line, fast, purposeful, heading toward a control shed. Shadow saw it too. His ears snapped, his head angled, his body leaned forward. Ethan felt the next phase forming. Climax was coming, and it wasn't going to be loud in the Hollywood way. It was going to be tight, tactical, 2 choices at a time, each one with consequences. Ethan tightened his grip on Maria's elbow. "Lucas," Ethan said, voice calm as steel, "stay with Captain Hayes. Get her clear." Lucas nodded. "Yes, sir." Ethan looked at Shadow. "With me." Shadow didn't hesitate. He moved with Ethan immediately, silent as rain. They stepped into the yard's dim, flickering light, toward the control shed, toward the figure by the fence, toward the place where someone was trying to turn a rescue into a disaster. The control shed sat near the facility's outer boundary, a squat metal box with warning stickers and a padlocked door, a maintenance access point for valves and pump systems, the kind of place most people ignored until something went wrong. Tonight, everything was wrong. Ethan moved low and fast, using stacked pallets and a concrete barrier as cover. Rain hammered his shoulders, water splashed at his boots. He kept his flashlight off, no need to announce himself when the world already flickered. Shadow stayed slightly ahead, nose low, then lifted. The dog's breathing changed, shorter, more focused. The figure at the fence line reached the shed and yanked at the door. Locked. The figure cursed and pulled something from a pocket. Keys, maybe, or a tool. Ethan's mind ticked through risk. If that person accessed the controls, they could trigger a spill, increase pressure, flood the yard, force everyone back, give remaining suspects cover to disappear. He clicked his radio to Doctor. "Moore?" "Lena, control shed near the boundary. Do you have eyes?" "I'm trying," Dr. Moore said, voice strained. "Facility cameras are unstable, but I see a spike in control input attempts. That shed feeds the valves in your sector." Ethan's jaw tightened. "Then that's our target." Shadow let out a quiet huff and froze. Ethan stopped too, body instantly still. A second later, Ethan heard it. The faint click of metal being handled, like a weapon being racked. The figure wasn't just opening a shed, they were preparing. Ethan lowered his voice, speaking to Shadow in the smallest tone he could. "Hold!" Shadow held, muscles loaded. Ethan shifted his angle, moving along the edge of a container stack until he had a line of sight. The figure's profile came into view under a flickering floodlight. Hood up, face partially obscured, shoulders squared. One hand at the shed lock, the other holding a compact firearm. Not a panicked employee, not a confused trespasser. A ringleader. The person tugged on the lock again, then glanced back toward the corridor door, checking if anyone followed. Ethan didn't rush. He waited for the right moment. When the suspect's attention narrowed to the lock, when the gun wasn't pointed outward. Then Ethan moved. He stepped out from cover, weapon up, voice cutting through rain. "Hands, now!" The suspect spun, gun lifting. Shadow exploded forward in the same instant. The suspect fired. The muzzle flash lit the rain for a heartbeat, and the shot snapped past Ethan's shoulder, close enough to make the air sting. Ethan didn't flinch into chaos. He dropped behind a concrete barrier, returning fire, not at the suspect's chest, but at the shed wall near the suspect's hand, forcing the gun line to break. Shadow hit the suspect's legs low, slamming into the knee. The suspect stumbled sideways, gun wavering. Ethan rose in a smooth motion, closing distance fast. The rain and alarms and floodlights tried to turn everything into confusion, but Ethan made it simple. Gun, hands, ground. The suspect fought to keep the firearm, jerking it up toward Shadow. Ethan shouted once, sharp, "No!" Shadow didn't bite the gun hand. He went for the forearm, clamping down through sleeve and muscle with enough force to control, but not tear. The suspect screamed, weapon clattering to the wet pavement. Ethan kicked the firearm away, then drove the suspect down with a shoulder and forearm, pinning them against the ground. The suspect bucked, trying to roll, trying to reach for something else, another tool, another weapon, a radio. Ethan twisted the arm behind the suspect's back and locked cuffs on with two harsh clicks. "Stop fighting," Ethan said, voice flat. "It's over." The suspect spat rainwater, eyes burning. "You don't understand what's in that corridor." Ethan's mouth tightened. "I understand you tried to kill Captain Hayes." The suspect's laugh was short and ugly. "I tried to keep her quiet." Behind Ethan, Shadow stood with chest heaving, ears high, eyes locked on the suspect's face. Rain slid off his muzzle like tears he didn't feel. Ethan looked up as the alarms shifted again, higher, faster. Dr. Moore's voice snapped through the radio. "Ethan, input stopped. Pressure is stabilizing. Whatever they were trying to do, you interrupted it." Ethan exhaled slowly, the first real breath he'd allowed himself in minutes. Then Lucas's voice came in, urgent. "Ethan, we've got movement near the corridor entrance. Someone's trying to push past me." Ethan's head snapped toward the facility entrance. The fog from the corridor was seeping outward now, thin but visible under the lights. Lucas stood near Maria, one hand on his weapon, the other gesturing for someone to stop. Ethan's blood ran cold. Not because he doubted Lucas, because he knew how quickly a desperate suspect could turn an injured captain into leverage. Ethan grabbed the suspect he'd cuffed by the collar and yanked them to their knees. "Stay." He didn't wait for an answer. He sprinted back toward Lucas and Maria, Shadow at his side like a second heartbeat. The yard was a battlefield of weather and light, sirens growing closer, rain harder, water deeper. Ethan's boots splashed as he ran, breath steady, mind focused. At the corridor entrance, Lucas had his gun raised, stance shaky but determined. "Back up!" he shouted. A figure in a dark jacket was pushing toward the door, hands raised in mock surrender, trying to close distance. "Lucas!" Ethan barked. Lucas glanced toward Ethan for half a second, just enough distraction that the figure lunged. The figure surged toward Maria. Maria tried to step back, pain catching. Her balance wavered. Ethan's pulse spiked into action. Shadow beat him to it. Shadow lunged between the figure and Maria, body slamming into the suspect's hips. The suspect stumbled, arms flailing. Lucas recovered, rookie speed and competence kicking in, moving to intercept, but the suspect swung wildly, trying to shove Shadow away, trying to reach Maria again. Ethan arrived and grabbed the suspect's arm, twisting it into a controlled lock. "Enough," Ethan said, voice cold. The suspect snarled, but Ethan drove them down to the wet pavement and cuffed them fast. Shadow stood over the suspect, teeth bared but not biting, a living warning. Lucas breathed hard, eyes wide. I almost... Ethan didn't scold. He didn't shame. He did what a disciplined leader did, stabilized the moment. "You held," Ethan said, "quick. You didn't let them through. Good." Lucas swallowed, nodding, relief and adrenaline making his hands tremble. Maria leaned against the SUV, breathing shallow, eyes tight. "They're desperate," Ethan nodded, "because they're losing control." Sirens closed in. Red and blue lights flashed through rain like broken stars. Hazmat trucks rolled up, personnel in protective gear moving toward the corridor entrance with practiced urgency. Dr. Moore's voice came calmer now. "Ethan, hazmat is on site. The corridor is being contained. You did it." Ethan looked down at Shadow. Shadow's eyes met his, steady, loyal, expressive even through rain. Ethan knelt for half a second, one gloved hand resting on Shadow's shoulder. A grounding touch, a silent thank you. Shadow leaned into it briefly, then looked back up, still working, still scanning, still protecting. Because this wasn't about applause, it was about survival, about partnership, about doing the right thing when the world tried to drown it. The extraction became orderly the way chaos does when professionals arrive with enough bodies and equipment to make the situation small. Hazmat sealed the corridor. The corrosive mist was contained before it spread into the yard. The valve systems were locked down. The flood pumps were restored to partial function. The yard's water line stabilized. Maria was guided into the SUV and taken to medical staging. She protested in her hoarse, pragmatic way, but even she couldn't argue with bruised ribs and the tremor of exhaustion in her hands. Ethan watched her go, posture still, face unreadable, but his eyes followed until the door shut. Lucas hovered near Ethan, soaked, mud-splattered, adrenaline still making him bounce slightly on his heels like he didn't know where to put his energy. "You okay?" Lucas asked, trying for casual and failing. Ethan nodded once. "You did fine." Lucas blinked. "Fine?" Ethan's mouth tightened into something almost like a smile. "Fine is good in a place like this." Lucas huffed a shaky laugh. "Yeah, fine is great." Dr. Moore arrived not long after, stepping out of a vehicle with a tablet tucked under one arm, hair damp at the temples, eyes sharp despite fatigue. She walked straight to Ethan, studying him the way she studied evidence, not to judge, but to understand. "You moved fast," she said quietly. Ethan shrugged, small. Shadow did. Dr. Moore's gaze flicked to Shadow, who sat beside Ethan now, wet and calm, ears swiveling even as the danger dissolved. "He's remarkable," she said. Ethan's eyes softened, just a fraction. "He's loyal." Dr. Moore looked back at Ethan. "So are you." It was the kind of statement that would have made Ethan uncomfortable on any other night. Praise sat oddly on him. He didn't need it, but he did need the truth. And that truth was simple. Maria was alive. The suspects were in custody. The building hadn't become a disaster, and Shadow was still at his side. Later, as the rain eased into a fine mist and the sirens faded into distance, Ethan stood under the facility overhang, water dripping from his jacket, looking out at the yard. He didn't feel triumphant. He felt steady. The kind of steadiness that came when grief loosened its grip for a moment and let purpose step forward. Shadow leaned gently against Ethan's leg, silent communication in full effect. "You're here, I'm here. We did it." Ethan reached down and rested his hand on Shadow's head, fingers pressing into wet fur. No speech, no dramatic promise, just presence. Just the bond that didn't need words. And somewhere behind them, inside the SUV heading to medical, Captain Maria Hayes breathed through pain and lived, because her officer and his K-9 refused to wait for permission to save her.